Recent climate change analysts and previews for 2025 indicate an accelerating climate crisis driven by record high greenhouse gas levels, leading to unprecedented global temperatures and intensified extreme weather events. So current policies are insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement goals, putting the world on a path to dangerous long-term warming. The Secretariat of the Climate Change and Futures in Africa Conference Series 2025 is currently underway in Windhoek in Namibia, and the conference is convened under the theme Risk in Time and Space, highlighting the disaster risks over time and space. Let's chat now to climate change. Well, in fact, let's focus on climate change and talk about the upcoming conference, the 30th UN Climate Conference, which will take place from the 6th to the 21st of November 2025. That will take place in Brazil. It will also place emphasis on community participation. Let's discuss this now with Dr Sanele Gamede, who is a climate change communication researcher in the SADC region. Doctor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We do appreciate your time. So the Secretariat of the Climate Change and Futures in Africa Conference Series 2025 is currently underway in Windhoek in Namibia. Can you talk us through some of the relevant issues that are going to be discussed at this conference? Often we see these conferences taking place, but when we talk about tangible change or some of the resolutions that need to be taken, we don't really see much shift. What's different about this particular conference?
Thank you so much, Cressida, and thank you for having me. It was an incredible conference that took place from Wednesday till Friday. Beside the fact that it was honored by the Prime Minister of Namibia and many dignitaries, researchers from all over Africa and the world. It was an incredible conference because it touched on the role of indigenous knowledge and communities in fighting climate change and fighting the issue of disasters and making sure that communities are ready. So it was a conference, I could say, as an attendee and as a researcher on climate change in the region. It was a conference that was not merely about presenting conference papers, but it was a conference that was meant to present solutions, especially with the involvement of governments in the conference. We saw the Gauteng government, it was represented here. So it was a conference that is really meant to shape solution more than just presenting scholarly papers.
And I mean, one of the discussions that were focused on was indigenous science versus Western science to address climate change challenges. What does this speak to, Doctor?
I think this was very interesting for me as a climate change communication researcher to see scholars working together in one voice, calling for the use of indigenous knowledge in making sure that our communities are ready to fight this scourge, and also they are ready to deal with some of these. So there was a call, and it concurred with the research that I've done in the region, visited 8 countries, and the young people pointed out that the climate communication is merely communicated in a more foreign way with use of big language or jargon, and there was a strong call that we Africanize the issue as Africans who are affected by this instead of dealing with it in a Western way.
Doctor, if I could ask you to just pause there just for a second. We've got some news that's just coming through, and this relates, of course, to Tanzania. I'll come back to you in just about a moment. I do apologize for that. Of course, results coming out of Tanzania indicating that the Electoral Commission in that country has declared that President Samia Suluhu Hassan has won the elections in that country with nearly 98% of the votes. The results, Hans Hassan, a 5-year term to govern the East African country. You'd recall, of course, during the course of this week, there'd been protests that erupted there. That was on Wednesday, well, during Wednesday's vote for president. And of course, with some of the protests in that particular country, there'd been some government buildings, of course, that had been set on fire. Those are the visuals that we saw during the course of the week. There was also tear gas as well as gunshots that had been fired in that country. Protesters were angry about the Electoral Commission's exclusion of Hassan's 2 biggest challenges from the race, and what they basically described as a widespread repression. Tanzania's main opposition party had said on Friday that hundreds of people had been killed in protests, with the UN Human Rights Office saying that credible reports indicate at least 10 people were killed in 3 cities. The government dismissed the opposition's death toll and basically said that it had been hugely exaggerated and rejected criticism of its human rights record. So essentially, coming out of that country, news just in, Tanzania's Electoral Commission declaring that President Samia Suluhu Hassan has won the elections in that country with nearly 98% of the votes. Of course, we saw some unrest that took place in that country during the course of the week, and there'd been some discontent about what was expected to be the outcome of that election, with the declaration of it now by the Electoral Commission in that country. Certainly we'll be watching to see what developments in Tanzania will be like. We also heard that the internet had been shut down, so communication in and out of that country, we do understand, had also been incredibly limited. With the declaration of these results now by the Electoral Commission of that country, I'm sure there'll be a close watch in terms of whether the protests in that country will continue, or what the response to this outcome will be. Let's continue or go back to our discussion now that we had been having on the UN Climate Conference, which will be taking place between the 6th and the 21st of November in Brazil, relating to climate change. And Dr Sanele Gamede had been joining us. Of course, he's a climate change communicator. And we had been talking a bit about the conference which had taken place in Namibia, which had been basically looking at some of the aspects relating to climate change. Doctor, apologies, and thank you so much for staying with us. We were talking about indigenous science versus Western science. Those were some of the issues that were discussed at the conference in Windhoek in Namibia. You described them as quite interesting. Talk to us again about why you indicate so, and what exactly does this speak to?
Thank you so much, my sister. I think one of the things that scholars and everyone who was there pointed out is that indigenous knowledge is seen as a crucial or is seen as very important for sustainable climate adaptation strategies in Africa, particularly, especially due to its grounded nature in local environmental conditions. And everyone kind of proposed that we lean towards making sure that when we are dealing with climate change issues and communicating and talking about climate change issues and disaster management, we involve communities, and we are cognizant of the languages that we use. In fact, researchers there were supporting an African-led community-based research initiatives that combine traditional knowledge with scientific methods for innovative and sustainable solutions for Africa, because Africa is affected, especially in the region. We have seen quite a lot in South Africa as well, due to issues of climate change, disasters, and all of that. So we need to involve indigenous knowledge and make sure that people know what we are talking about, instead of talking about scientific words that they don't understand.
Yeah, we're looking to COP30. I mean, what should South Africa and the rest of the continent, be asking for at that conference? What should we be discussing now that already has not been put on the table in terms of, contributions of countries to emissions, and how do we tackle some of, the contentious issues that we often see at, these conferences around the world?
I almost took the opportunity to say something from my research, of course, on the issue of climate
Please
change
go ahead,
communication.
Doctor.
To say my visit across the region and speaking to over 400 young people in 13 universities pointed out that the issue of climate change is out there, but it's far distant for some young people who are stressed on issues of unemployment, issues of gender-based violence, issues of, bread and butter, social issues and all of that, especially in the region. So the way climate change is communicated, they pointed out that it needs to be decolonized, it needs to be something that speaks to the people on the ground, speak to the local people. But allow me to say, I think in COP30, if I was there, I was going to say we need to recognize and support for Africa-led climate science and innovation, especially incorporating indigenous knowledge into global climate policies. And I think the increase in funding and resources for community-based climate resilient initiative will help empower local populations and young people in the region. And of course, we need to enhance international cooperation and technology transfer to help mitigate and adapt the issue of climate risk, issues of food security, water management, and disaster preparedness. And I think, Ms. Chrisada, we need to make sure that everyone is willing to invest on disaster preparedness or issues of managing disasters instead of funding a climate change initiative. Let us make sure that countries, especially in the region, are ready to manage issues of disaster.
And on that point, what would some of the potential solutions be, in particular for the continent?
The continent, I think it needs to ensure that it is ready. We have seen a lot of countries going through disasters, and what we have noticed is that it looks like countries, they just reacting on issues. They seem to be asleep, if I may put it in that way. It's like the governments are just waking up and then there's a landslide. It's not like they are prepared about this. I think they need to make sure that this research that is done by scholars is taken into account in the decision making, and they listen to some of the suggestions, the policy drafts that scholars have been putting in front of government officials. So we need to ensure that we are ready to act on this, and educational programs when it comes to communicating climate change needs to start on the ground. We need young people to know about climate change as young as 5 years, because we are the youngest continent. The future of the continent is young, and young people must be involved. And for you to involve them is making sure that you expose them to opportunities within fighting climate change, so that they don't see this thing as something like number 10 in their priority list, because you have opened job opportunities and entrepreneurial opportunities in the fighting of climate change.
Dr. Gamede, thank you very much indeed for your time. Always appreciate your insights here on SABC News. Dr. Sanele Gamede is a climate change communication researcher in the SADC region. Thank you very much indeed for your time.